Appreciate everybody being here this evening. We're going to continue on with our study of William Paley's Evidences of Christianity. I'm going to have to click something back here. All right, so I'm back. My clicker won't work if I don't do that, so... Remember last week when we left off, I gave you one thing, just one thing. That's all I ask. I'm just kidding. Well, not kidding, but I'm kind of overselling it a little bit. The reading of Isaiah 52, verse 13 through 12, 53, verse 12. I'm not sure if you had a chance to do that, but if anybody did and you'd like to brag about it, you can certainly speak up. But I know that we don't like to brag. That's probably something we'd frown upon. So I won't put anybody on the spot. So we'll read it ourselves. How about that? But we do want to point out that anyone who reads Isaiah 53 cold without knowing it's from the Old Testament assumes that it's a description of Jesus. The language is that specific, that detailed, that unmistakable. And that is exactly the problem for anyone trying to explain this passage as coincidence. I even went back and hit it and it's not working. My clicker's not working. Huh. It's weird. Bombed out on me here. Try it again. There we go. Good. All right, so before we begin though, we're going to do something that we haven't typically done in the series. We're going to actually read a passage of Scripture through almost in its entirety, not necessarily as a devotional content, but as evidence. We're going to treat it the way a lawyer treats an exhibit. We're going to ask, what does this document claim? When was it written? Who preserved it? And does it match the historical record? Paley, who had access to the best textual scholarship of his day, said of Isaiah 53, the application of the prophecy to the angelic history is plain and appropriate. Here is no double sense. Now that's a strong claim. Tonight, we're going to show why he was right to make that claim. So let's read. I don't know if you can see that. It's kind of small, but I'll read it to you. So let's try and think about this. Let's read this as if you're hearing it for the first time. Oh, hey, Barbara, come on in. So we're just starting out. We're going to read, and you might not can see that. I can't hardly see it up here. So you might have to read along in the Bible. I'll just read it to you. Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 53, verse 12. Now this was written about 700 years before Christ. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. As many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred, more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. The kings shall shut their mouths at him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, for he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, because he hath poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So 700 years before Jesus, written, preserved, copied, and handed down by a people who did not believe that Jesus was their Messiah. So before we go verse by verse, let's highlight what stands out on a first reading, the structural features of this passage that makes it so remarkable. First, this is about a single individual. The servant is described as he throughout, not Israel, not a community, not a symbol, but a person with a face that is marred, a mouth that stays closed, a grave that can be located. When we get to the Jewish interpretation question, this will matter enormously. Second, the suffering is voluntary. The passage says that he poured out his soul unto death. He was not simply caught and killed. He willingly gave himself. This is not the language of a military defeat or a national catastrophe. It is the language of chosen sacrifice. Third, the suffering is vicarious. He bears the griefs and sorrows of others. He is wounded for their transgressions, bruised for their iniquities. With his stripes we are healed. Someone else's suffering produces someone else's healing. This is substitutionary logic, and it is unmistakable. Fourth, the servant is innocent. He had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. This is not Israel's history. I'm going to stop there. Move on. This is not the history of any nation. It is the description of a morally perfect individual. Fifth, and this is the detail that stops readers cold. Verse 9 says, he is assigned a grave with the wicked, but is buried with the rich. Two separate facts, separately stated in one verse. Not one or the other, but both. So we'll come back to how that was fulfilled. Sixth, there is something after the death. Verse 10 says, he will see his seed and prolong his days after making his soul an offering for sin. He dies. The passage is unambiguous about that. Cut off out of the land of the living. And then he lives on. There's no natural way to read this without concluding that Isaiah is pointing towards something beyond death. So, let's go verse by verse. Let's be systematic. We're going to walk through the major claims of Isaiah 53 and show exactly where and how each one was fulfilled. So again, I'm working from Paley's own analysis, but we're going into more detail than he does. Isaiah 52:14. His visage was so marred more than any man. The servant will be physically unrecognizable from his suffering. John 19:1-3 records that before the crucifixion, Jesus was flogged by Roman soldiers. Roman flogging, the flagellum. Doesn't that sound, it's weird because you know what a flagellum is, right, from biology class. That seems kind of gross, but kind of cute, right? But I mean, just think about that. The flagellum in this context is horrifying. It was a leather whip embedded with bone fragments and metal. It routinely tore flesh down to the bone. Josephus, the Jewish historian, describes men being flogged until their entrails were visible. The condemned man would then carry his cross, sometimes called the crossbar, to the execution site. By the time Jesus arrived at Golgotha, marred more than any man is not hyperbole. Isaiah 53:3. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows. We esteemed him not. John 1 verse 11. John 1 verse 11. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Luke 23:18. The crowd shouts, "Away with this man!" The religious establishment, the crowds, his own nation, rejected him. That's the theme of the Passion narrative. Isaiah 53 and verse 5. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. With his stripes we are healed. 1 Peter 2:24 quotes this verse directly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Peter, the eyewitness, identifies the verse, identifies the fulfillment, and identifies the theological meaning. He had been there. Isaiah 53:7. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter. He opened not his mouth. Matthew 27:12-14 says, But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, Do you not hear how many things they testify against you? But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. So Pilate's amazed, a man facing execution who won't even offer a defense. Isaiah had described this. Luke 23:9 records that before Herod, Jesus answered him nothing. Isaiah 53:8, by an oppressive judgment he was taken off. This is Bishop Loth's more precise translation of the Hebrew, which Paley endorses. Pilate declared Jesus innocent 3 times. Luke 23:4, I find no guilt in this man. Luke 23:14, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. And then Luke 23:22, what evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. 3 declarations of innocence followed by execution. That is oppressive judgment by any measure. Even though the very man who's supposed to decide his fate says, I don't see he's not guilty of anything. It says it 3 times, 3 different instances, and yet still he was taken off. And they had to, and that in itself was substitutionary, right? Give us Barabbas. I mean, he had to even offer that up as the reason for taking Jesus off. He had to leave it up to them, because if it was up to him, it seemed like he was, he had already washed his hands, of course, of the thing, but I think that he wanted him to go free. Isaiah 53:9, the first part, his grave was appointed with the wicked. Luke 23:32-33, 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. So Jesus was executed between criminals. That is his grave appointed with the wicked. And then Isaiah 53:9, the second part, but with the rich man was his tomb. And then immediately in the same verse, a completely separate fact, Matthew 27:57-60 says, when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen, clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb. So he was executed with criminals, buried by a wealthy man. Two unconnected facts written in one verse of one prophecy 7 centuries before they happened. Neither was staged. Jesus had no control over where he was executed or who took his body. Joseph of Arimathea was not coordinating with anyone to fulfill Scripture. Isaiah 53:10, second part of verse 10, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days. This is the one that sits most uncomfortably in the text, and it is the one that Paley points to as logically requiring something beyond ordinary death. The passage has just said he is cut off out of the land of the living. He dies, and then he will see his descendants. He will prolong his days. You cannot prolong your days after you're dead unless something extraordinary follows the death. The Christian answer is obvious. The resurrection is what Isaiah 53:10, part B, is pointing toward. That is a vindication after death that extends the servant's life into something that death cannot terminate. Peter preaches this explicitly in Acts 2, quoting Psalm 16:10, "You will not abandon my soul to Hades or let your Holy One see corruption," as a resurrection prophecy. Isaiah 53:10b is the same kind of statement. Death is not the end. Then Isaiah 53:11, "By the knowledge of him shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities." Romans 5:19 says, "For as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous." Paul is applying Isaiah's logic directly. One person's sacrifice justifies many. That is exactly the theology of the cross, and Isaiah announced it 700 years before the cross was built. Isaiah 53:12a, the first part, "He was numbered with the transgressors." Luke 22:37 is one of the most remarkable moments in the entire gospel narrative. Jesus at the Last Supper quotes Isaiah 53:12 directly and says, "For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me." And he was numbered with the transgressors. Jesus knew. He knew which verse applied to him. He was telling his disciples, this night, this week, the prophecy that has sat in your scriptures for 7 centuries is about to be completed. And it was. Mark 15:27 through 28 records it. And then Isaiah 53:12b, the next part. "He bare the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." Luke 23, verse 34, "And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Jesus is dying, nails through his wrists, through his hands, cross erected, Roman soldiers at his feet, and he prays, not for himself, not for deliverance, but for the people who are killing him. Made intercession for the transgressors from the cross in his dying words. So let's pause on 2 details specifically because they deserve special attention. Isaiah 53:9, the wicked and the rich. Paley quotes Bishop Loth's improved translation. "His grave was appointed with the wicked, but with the rich man was his tomb." Here's why this is so remarkable. These are 2 contradictory facts packed into a single verse. A man executed as a criminal with criminals is, in normal circumstances, either buried with them in a common grave or thrown in the Valley of Hinnom, which was Jerusalem's garbage dump and the standard disposal site for executed criminals. He's not buried in a private, wealthy man's tomb. What happened with Jesus is historically anomalous. Joseph of Arimathea intervened. He went to Pilate personally, at some personal risk, as a member of the Sanhedrin, publicly associating himself with a man just condemned by that same body, and secured the body before sunset. He placed Jesus in his newly cut tomb. This was not predicted by Christian theology. This is not something his disciples arranged. It is simply what happened. And Isaiah had described exactly these two contradictory features 7 centuries earlier. And then Isaiah 53:10b, he dies, then prolongs his days. This is the logical problem that Paley signals without fully spelling it out, but we're going to make it explicit. The passage cannot mean Israel, because Israel has not died and returned from the dead. The passage cannot mean a national metaphor, because prolongs his days after being cut off out of the land of the living is not a metaphor. It is a statement of continued existence after death. And it cannot mean simply the continuation of the servant's memory or influence, because the Hebrew, I'm going to butcher this, Yarik Yamim, he shall prolong his days, is the language of living, not of legacy. The only explanation that makes this verse coherent is resurrection. Isaiah, 700 years before Golgotha, described what would look like a dead end, and then told you it wasn't one. So now we're going to address the most common objection that you will encounter when you share Isaiah 53 with some people. That's not about Jesus. Modern Jewish interpretation says it refers to the nation of Israel as a whole. This is a real position. Many modern Jewish commentators do argue that the servant in Isaiah 53 represents the Jewish people collectively, suffering among the nations, being vindicated in the future restoration. So we're going to treat this argument respectfully, but answer it honestly. Here's what Jewish interpreters claim. Isaiah uses my servant elsewhere to mean Israel. Isaiah 41:8, Isaiah 44:1. The suffering of the servant could describe Israel's exile and persecution. The vindication could describe Israel's eventual restoration. Here's why Paley says this interpretation fails, and he is exactly right. Problem number 1, the we versus he distinction. This is Paley's sharpest argument. If Israel is the servant who is speaking in verses like, he hath borne our griefs, he was wounded for our transgressions, with his stripes we are healed, the speaker is distinct from the servant. A we group is describing what a he person has done for them. If the servant is Israel, then you need a separate nation, distinct from Israel, speaking about how Israel's suffering healed them. That's not what the text says, and it does not fit any historical scenario. Usually it's the other way around, isn't it? I'm sorry. God, no, don't get political. Got to stop it. Problem number 2, the servant is innocent. He had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. No one reading the Old Testament's own account of Israel's history, the golden calf, the rebellion in the wilderness, the corruption of the kings, can honestly apply this description to the nation. It fits no national history. It fits one person. Problem number 3, individual burial details. His grave with the wicked, with the rich man was his tomb. Graves and private tombs don't apply to a nation. Nations are not buried, although maybe they should be. Maybe they will be. Paley notes this directly. The mention of the grave and the tomb in the 9th verse is not very applicable to the fortunes of a nation. Then problem number 4, voluntary individual intercession. He poured out his soul unto death, made intercession for the transgressors. Nations don't voluntarily pour out their soul. Nations don't intercede for others at the moment of death. This is individual, voluntary, priestly action. Paley quotes his sources directly on the ancient Jewish position. There is good proof that the ancient rabbins explained it of their expected Messiah. This is documented. The pre-Christian Targums, Aramaic translations of the Hebrew text, apply Isaiah 53 to the Messiah. The Talmud references it in a messianic context. It was only after Christianity began using this passage that the interpretation shifted. So that's kind of a giveaway, right? And Paley quotes a Latin source that translates roughly, "This prophecy of Isaiah is the carnificina, the torture chamber of the rabbis." Even some Jewish scholars have privately admitted the rabbis could handle almost any prophetic text except Isaiah 53. That one was different. So that one's the, I might remember that name, the carnificina, the torture chamber of the rabbis. I mean, I think it's because it is an exact description of Jesus and the suffering he went through, everything. It fits to a T. There's nothing about it that is off. It's all just dead on. So again, yeah, you're gonna feel like you've been tortured if you have to try and explain that one away. So let's talk about Origen's decisive argument. Paley presents a fascinating piece of historical testimony from Origen, a 3rd century Christian scholar who was debating learned Jewish rabbis. Origen used Isaiah 53 extensively in these debates. The rabbis argued, as some do today, that the passage described the Jewish people collectively. Origen pressed them specifically on Isaiah 53:8, "For the transgression of my people was he smitten to death." If Israel is the servant, then who is my people? The servant cannot be identical to my people. The servant is smitten for them. So, obviously, when this was mentioned, the rabbis fell silent because they couldn't answer that. Now, here is Paley's critical observation. These were meticulous scholars who knew the Hebrew text cold. In every other dispute where the Greek or Aramaic translation diverged from the Hebrew, the rabbis immediately corrected the Christian and appealed to the original. That was their standard tactic, and it consistently worked. But on this verse, they said nothing. Paley concludes, it seems almost impossible not to conclude from Origen's argument and the silence of his Jewish adversaries that the Hebrew text at that time actually had the word "to death." Their silence is testimony. You only stay silent when you have no counter-argument. So that was an interesting little tidbit. Paley closes his treatment of Isaiah 53 with what we might consider the most elegant challenge in the entire book. He writes, "There is no other eminent person to the history of whose life so many circumstances can be made to apply. They who object that much has been done by the power of chance, the ingenuity of accommodation, and the industry of research, ought to try whether the same or anything like it could be done if Muhammad or any other person were proposed as the subject of Jewish prophecy." This is a falsifiability challenge. Paley is saying, don't just assert that the match between Isaiah 53 and Jesus is coincidence or contrived. Test it. Take any other historical figure you like, Muhammad, Caesar, Genghis Khan, Buddha, Napoleon. Try to fit Isaiah 53 to their life. Try to find a figure who was despised and rejected by his own people, suffered voluntarily for others' transgressions, was executed as a criminal between criminals, was buried in a wealthy private tomb immediately after, died, and then prolonged his days, made intercession for the people killing him while dying. Go ahead. The exercise fails immediately. Muhammad died at home in his own bed, revered by his followers, not rejected by them. Caesar was not buried with the rich after being executed with criminals. Buddha died peacefully of food poisoning. None of them made intercession for their killers. None of them prolonged their days after being cut off out of the land of the living. Paley's challenge has been sitting there for 230 years. It has not been answered. Oh, that one got cut off a bit at the top. Paley also develops a second prophecy argument in chapter 1 that we want to touch on just briefly. Jesus' own prediction of Jerusalem's destruction. In Luke 21, Matthew 24, and Mark 13, Jesus predicts that Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies, that not one stone of the temple will be left on another, that the inhabitants will fall by the sword and be led captive into all nations. He gives this prediction approximately AD 30. In AD 70, 40 years later, the Roman general Titus besieged Jerusalem, breached the walls, burned the temple to the ground, and killed or enslaved the population. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience, provides a detailed account that matches Jesus' prediction in remarkable particularity. Paley's argument that the Gospels predate AD 70 is careful and worth knowing. The Gospels record the prediction but never mention its fulfillment. Luke, who elsewhere notes when prophecies are fulfilled, he tells us Agabus' famine prediction came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar, says nothing about the destruction. That's worth noting, I think. An author writing after AD 70 would almost certainly have said at some point, and this is what happened. The absence of that note is evidence of pre-AD 70 authorship, and therefore evidence that the prediction preceded the event. If Jesus was predicting from knowledge, not from hindsight, then he was either an extraordinarily accurate guesser in a city under Roman rule that had been rebellious for a generation, or he was who he said he was. So you understand that argument? I mean, I think that's a pretty good argument. You know, if the Bible is written after the fact, so that pins it down. I mean, that says this is pre-AD 70. This is right there, written within the lifespan of the people that were eyewitnesses. Had it been written after the fact, it would have been noted that, and this is what happened. All right, so the cumulative force. Before we get to application, we're going to step back and we're going to show us where we stand now. Over weeks 6 and 7, we have presented the prophecy argument in two forms. Week 6, 48 plus messianic prophecies, statistical probabilities, you remember that, of 1 in 10 to the 157th power, prophecies Jesus couldn't control. Tonight, Isaiah 53 alone, 12 plus specific details in a single chapter, preserved by adversaries, authenticated by the silence of the rabbis in Origen's debate, plus the bonus, Jesus' own prediction of Jerusalem's destruction, fulfilled in AD 70 but unmentioned in the Gospels as already fulfilled. These are independent lines of argument. The statistical argument doesn't depend on Isaiah 53 alone. The Isaiah 53 argument doesn't depend on the statistical framework, and both are entirely independent of the resurrection evidence from weeks 4 and 5, and the martyr testimony from weeks 2 and 3. Each line stands on its own, and together they're overwhelming. It's like making a rope out of strands. The rope itself is strengthened by all of those strands. Any one of those strands could be falsified. It would not make the rope break. So these things all stand on their own, but together they are incredibly, they hold lots of weight. There's got to be some good analogy. Wow, I hate stringing you along. I'm sorry. I use the same. I'm sorry. You trying to rope me into an argument? I was, yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, we don't want to leave the audience hanging, so let's continue. All right, so slide 14, application. 4 questions for personal reflection. and conversation. And again, these are ideas, we don't necessarily have to apply these to ourselves. We can certainly have conversations with other people around us. Interesting topic for sure. Isaiah 53 alone. If you read Isaiah 53 before this series and you didn't know it was in the Old Testament, you didn't know the book, you didn't know the century, where would you assume it came from? If you didn't know anything about the Bible and you read that.
I see people doing that online.
Oh, really?
They'll go around asking a bunch of Jewish people, will you read this for me? And the ones who never came across this, because they don't really go over Isaiah 53 that often. So a Christian will ask them and film them. What do you think it's talking about? It sounds like it's talking about Jesus, but they didn't tell them that they don't have it in the Bible. They just have it written out.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like it's clearly talking about Jesus. Well, that's actually in it's actually in Isaiah 53, and they just all clam up.
Wasn't that, it's not exactly the same thing, but you remember the Ethiopian eunuch?
Yes.
Yeah, he's reading and he was like, who's he talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
So, that's kind of a chicken and egg thing, That's where, Philip joins himself to the chariot and he's, answering the guy's question. So, again, that was providence there, I think, when he's reading this particular verse. But we could kind of make our own providence if we, pose that question, as you say, to other people. So who do you think this is talking about? It's amazing how you can ask people to comment on verses. Hey, the verse says this. What do you think that means? That's a good way to kind of get a hook, because people don't want to be wrong, and so either they won't answer at all, or they'll give you some, common wisdom, and then you kind of get them into that argument mode where some people just like to argue, they just want to be right, and so you can kind of keep the conversation. It's a tactic that works for some people, not others. Some people they walk away because they know they're not equipped. They know that they're unarmed.
It's funny, you see some of the people, they'll say something that a political figure said, about border security or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Who said this? Well, that was actually Obama that said that.
Oh, I saw a clip where it seemed like it was that loser, Bill Maher, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He was, I had to give him credit, though. I think he had Adam Schiff on, and he was saying, well, now here, the administration said this, that the president is taking, unilateral action on this country because it was in our best interest, something along those lines. So do you think that is that's good enough? And he said, no, of course not. Well, that was Obama said that,
That's right.
Anyway, so yeah, some of those are fun arguments to get in with. But you got to know your audience. You got to kind of be careful about that kind of stuff. That can backfire on you. All right, so what about another application, the Jewish silence? What does it tell us that Origen's Jewish opponents, meticulous scholars who knew the text better than he did, who consistently used textual arguments to win these debates, fell silent when pressed on Isaiah 53:8? They had every incentive to correct him if they could, but they couldn't. And they didn't. So what does silence from a hostile expert mean? Some of these are very, they're not obvious, right? They're subtle, some of these arguments, but they're powerful and they're persuasive. That's one of those, I would say, that, it might be subtle at first. Maybe it's something you don't even notice. It's like the absence of something can tell you more sometimes than the presence of something. For evangelism, if you have a Jewish friend or neighbor, Isaiah 53 is not a weapon, it's an invitation. You're not necessarily trying to win an argument. You're trying to, when you say argument, an argument presumes that there is points and counterpoints. This is just the truth, right? So I guess we'll say that. We're trying to open a door. The right approach isn't, I can prove you're wrong, but I've been reading something I'd love your perspective on. So again, that's, tip for your, if you have a Jewish neighbor. For evangelism, for your own faith, we're 7 weeks in. Next week is our last lesson, the cumulative case. So let's think about, in preparation for that, what's the single strongest line of evidence from the series that has strengthened your confidence in Jesus? So just kind of think about that, and maybe we'll talk about it next week. Action steps this week. Read Isaiah 53 again, this time with the gospel alongside it. Read a verse of Isaiah, then find its fulfillment in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Read the account of Jerusalem's fall in Luke 21, and then look up Josephus's account. You can find Josephus's Jewish Wars, Book 6, free online. Read his description of the siege, the armies, the famine, the destruction of the temple, stone by stone, and compare it to what Jesus said 40 years earlier. Maybe we'll do that. It might be fun. I mean, in a scholarly way. I mean, reading about the extermination of the Jewish nation, I don't mean it like that. Share Isaiah 53 with someone this week. Don't explain it first, just read it. We were talking about this. All right, so key takeaways. So here's our closing. Got a couple more slides and then we'll be done. You just like this series because I actually end on time. I know what it is. Takeaway number 1, Isaiah 53 is the most detailed messianic prophecy in all of Scripture. Paley calls its application to Jesus plain and appropriate with no double sense. Every major claim the chapter makes, rejection, silence before accusers, unjust judgment, burial with criminals, burial in a rich man's tomb, death followed by extended life, intercession for transgressors, was fulfilled precisely in the events of AD 30. Takeaway number 2, every major claim of Isaiah 53 was fulfilled in Jesus' death and resurrection, including 2 that could not have been staged. The burial with criminals and the burial in Joseph's wealthy tomb are 2 unconnected historical facts that Isaiah packed into one verse 700 years in advance. Neither was arranged by the disciples. Neither was predicted as a theological point. It simply happened, exactly as written. Takeaway number 3, no other figure in history fits this description. Paley's challenge, apply Isaiah 53 to Muhammad or anybody else you choose, has stood for 230 years without a credible answer. The specificity of Isaiah 53 is itself the argument. So, next week, our final session, bringing it all together, the cumulative case for Christianity. We'll review every line of evidence we've examined, show why the cumulative case is stronger than any individual argument, compare Christianity's unique verifiability to other world religions, and close with the challenge that Paley himself closes with, and that every generation of Christian inherits. We did not follow cleverly devised myths. We saw, we heard, we touched, and we're accountable to share what we know. All righty. Unless you have any other comments, I'll